The north is cold and full of whispers.
The training yard was empty. That was the point. The great hall above threw torchlight through its high windows, and the sound of Robert Baratheon's laugh carried all the way down to the stones, huge and genuine and slightly too loud. The laugh of a man who drank because it was the only thing that made him remember being young. Jon had learned to track Robert's mood by that laugh before he ever saw the man's face. Expansive tonight. Nostalgic, the specific warmth of a king revisiting the last place that had ever felt like home. Jon adjusted his grip and drove the practice sword through its fourth combination. The cold didn't bother him. He was built for this, for the dark outside and the cold stone, and the particular silence of a Winterfell night when everyone else was seated and warm and accounted for. The hall's warmth was visible from here, orange light pressing against the high windows, candle smoke shimmering in the glass. He didn't belong to that warmth. Everyone understood this. He had understood it longer than anyone else had. He didn't resent it tonight. He simply worked. The guard, Harwin, patient, 20 years his senior, raised his shield and came again. Jon ducked under the overhead, stepped inside Harwin's reach where the man's longer arms became useless. The practice sword found the gap between elbow and ribs with exactly enough pressure to register. Harwin grunted and stepped back. Reset, again above, a window caught the firelight and held it. Robert Baratheon had gone quiet. Ned felt it before he understood it, the specific silence that opened beside the king when something captured him fully. Robert could fill a hall with his presence or evacuate himself from a room without leaving it, and the quiet version was always the one that mattered. Ned set down his cup and followed the direction of the king's gaze. The yard below. The boy working in it. "Who's that?" Ned didn't need to look. "My bastard." He said it the way he said everything it cost him. Flat. 2 words to identify and none to explain. Robert watched Jon disarm Harwin with a sequence that should have taken 5 more years to develop. The sidestep. The close. The placement. The economy of someone who fought to finish rather than to be watched, and barked a single note of genuine surprise. "Gods, Ned, how old is he?" 14. Robert drank and kept watching. His face had taken on the warmth it only found in rooms like this one, near men like Ned, near something honest and physical that kingship almost never provided. He watched Jon reset. He watched another exchange, another clean disarm. Look at that. That's not trained into a boy. That's born in him. Then, bring him south. And there it was. Ned looked at the wine in his cup and thought about the wall. He had thought about the wall for 3 years the way you thought about a door that solved a problem. Black cloak. Black castle. The permanent invisibility of a bastard in service on an ice shelf at the edge of the world. No one important watches those men. Jon would disappear into it and be safe in the specific way that erasure is safe. Nothing that isn't seen can be targeted. The wall was a door closing quietly on everything that could go wrong. Robert had just opened a different one. Ned thought about Catelyn next, and not about her anger. He could manage her anger. He thought about the quality of the silence she produced when Jon entered a room she was already in. Not cruelty, she was not a cruel woman. Something more considered than cruelty, indifference maintained with effort, the particular chill of a woman who had decided the thing in front of her was a wound to be endured rather than a person to be known. The longer Jon stayed in Winterfell, the more that silence hardened into something that would outlast all of them. He thought about Varys. About Littlefinger. About the specific profession of men who built their currency from the arithmetic of bastards, who appeared in whose household, when they appeared, whose face they carried. A boy who looked exactly right, who arrived in Ned Stark's arms from Dorne in the same year Lyanna Stark died, that was not a difficult calculation for the minds that circled the small council tables of the realm. The longer Jon existed in Winterfell without explanation, the more dangerous he became to the wrong kind of attention. Under Ned's direct eye, Jon was visible. Controlled, Ned could watch. He could intervene in the things that needed intervening. And Robert had asked. Robert, who had come north with 17 years of grief, packed into a body going quietly to ruin. Who had found in Winterfell the last 24 hours of being young again, Robert had asked for something good, with the specific generosity of a man who believes he is giving rather than taking. Ned could not refuse that. Yes, he said. One word. He didn't feel it land yet. Catelyn received the news the way she received all things that could not be changed, with the stillness of a woman who has already calculated that every move available to her makes things worse. She could not argue against a king's request. She could not keep Jon in Winterfell now, and the relief she felt at that, the shameful relief of a wound finally beginning to close, made her go colder than she intended. She was aware of this. She could not stop it. The look she gave Jon when he was told was not hatred. Hatred would have been easier to navigate. It was the expression of a woman trying to feel something other than what she actually felt, and failing by a margin she would not permit herself to measure. Jon absorbed it the way he absorbed everything from her, without reaction, without complaint, with the quiet accuracy of a boy who had stopped hoping for something different long enough ago that the hope itself had gone clean away. Ned found him in the training yard, not in his room, not at the lower table. Here, still working, 2 hours after the hall had moved to its second course, driving combinations into the cold the way he always did after evenings when his presence in other rooms had made things complicated. Ned stood at the yard's edge and watched for a moment. "You're going south," he said. Jon stopped. Turned. His breathing was even. Not surprise, not quite. The catalogue had already been running. The king's posture at the high table, the direction of his gaze toward the windows, Ned's face when he returned from the conversation. Jon had been assembling the shape of this answer for hours. The wall, he started, is not what Robert wants. Ned reached inside his cloak and held something out. A blade, small, no famous name, no Valyrian steel, no house sigil pressed into the pommel, just iron in a plain sheath. The kind of thing a man carried in his boot rather than on his belt. The kind of thing that didn't announce itself in corridors where everything announced itself. The wall would have kept you safe by keeping you unseen. What you're riding toward cannot be managed by unseen. Jon looked at the blade. Then he took it. Cold, heavier than it looked. "Watch," Ned said. "Listen to what isn't being said as much as what is." He paused, and there was something in his face that Jon had no name for, some weight the words were moving around rather than through, some old accounting not yet ready to be settled. The wolves survive because they know when to be still. Jon turned the blade once in his hand, slid it into his boot. "When do we leave?" "At dawn, with the king's party." He went to pack. He didn't have much. He had never had much. Morning came gray and pressing, the kind of Winterfell dawn that leaned on the stones. The column assembled in the outer yard, horses and banners and the low noise of a royal party beginning its long southward unwinding. Jon saddled his own horse, checked his own gear, found his position in the escort without waiting to be placed. He was aware of each of them the way he was always aware of things that mattered. Rickon at the column's edge, holding Jon's stirrup leather for 2 beats too long before he let go. Robb at the gate, jaw set, wanting to say something that hadn't found words yet, settling for a look that said it imperfectly. Arya at the far end of the gate, fierce and entirely unconvincing in her deliberate indifference, raising her arm and waving once with the whole of it, because she was 9 years old and hadn't yet learned to perform smaller versions of what she felt. He looked up once at the window above the gate. Catelyn was there. She didn't come down. The column moved. Winterfell's gray towers caught the first flat light and held it briefly, the way stones held things briefly before releasing them. The yard sounds shrank. The gate fell behind. Jon rode out with his back to the only home that had ever been his, regardless of whether it had ever been actually his. He turned south, toward what was coming, toward whatever needed doing. He didn't look back again. The column had been moving for 3 weeks, and Jon had been watching for all of them. He'd started with Joffrey because Joffrey was the most legible thing in the party. The principle was straightforward once you found it. The prince drew his sword only against targets that couldn't effectively hit back, against trained men, against knights, against anyone capable of demonstrating consequences. Joffrey went agreeable and distant and found somewhere else to be. Against a stable boy who'd looked at him too long, against a dog tethered close enough to kick, against anything with no recourse, He found his courage reliably and without hesitation. Jon filed it as a pattern, not a judgment. Patterns were more useful. Cersei was harder to read. She had looked at Jon twice in 3 weeks. The first look was assessment. She catalogued threats the moment they entered range, the way Jon catalogued threats, and he recognized the process even when it was aimed at him. The second look was dismissal. That was the one that stayed with him. Cersei Lannister had looked at Ned Stark's bastard escort and decided, clearly and finally, that he wasn't worth her attention. A woman who read rooms the way she did didn't dismiss things because they were safe. She dismissed them because deciding they were safe was more useful than admitting they weren't. He filed that too. Jaime had tested him twice. Once with a question about northern scouting formations, the kind no southern lord asked unless he wanted to map exactly what a boy from Winterfell actually knew. Once with silence, Jaime dropped back to ride alongside Jon for a quarter mile and said nothing, watching him from his peripheral vision, measuring what a quarter mile next to the Kingslayer would produce. Jon gave it nothing. Jaime nodded once, barely perceptible, and returned to the front. Jon didn't know what the nod meant. He kept it anyway. Tyrion had tried riddles. Jon answered one correctly and returned one that Tyrion hadn't heard before, which produced a small silence of the pleased kind before Tyrion moved on. Jon suspected that giving less made him more interesting to Tyrion than more would have. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks building the map of what each of them wanted, what each of them feared, where the lines between the two ran thin enough to use. The stop near the Trident was unscheduled. Hot afternoon, horses needing water, the columns spreading into the loose shape a party assumed when the formal order relaxed, servants with water skins, riders stretching their legs, the hierarchy softening at its edges. Jon had finished watering his horse and was moving back toward the main body when he saw Joffrey. The prince had found Arya and Micah 20 feet from the tree line. Away from the river. Away from the adults. The two of them in the middle of a practice session with river cut sticks, Micah showing Arya a defensive parry with the earnest focus of a boy who didn't understand that what he was doing could be taken wrong. Jon saw Joffrey's posture shift. Subtle. The lean forward. The particular quality of boredom, becoming something with an edge, the hand going to the hilt of lion's tooth. He moved. Not running. Moving. The steady pace of a man who knew where he was going and was going there now, closing the distance in the time it took Joffrey to clear his sword from the scabbard. He stepped between the prince and the 2 children. "Your Grace," he said. 2 words. The complete certainty of someone who had already decided what was happening here and was informing rather than requesting. It stopped Joffrey 3 feet from where he'd intended to stop. The sword was out. He had an audience, just the children and 1 bastard escort, but an audience, and the mathematics of it were already working against him. He could not back away from a bastard in front of witnesses. He was 12 years old, and everything he was required to be depended on never backing away. He advanced. Jon stepped left. 1 small step, almost incidental, his shoulder rolling to let the thrust past him. Joffrey's momentum carried him forward into nothing, and his foot found uneven ground, and for 1 unretrievable second the crown prince of the 7 kingdoms came within a breath of falling over his own feet. Jon's hand found Joffrey's arm before the fall completed. The grip was firm and entirely neutral. "The ground is uneven here, Your Grace." Easy, the rage on Joffrey's face was total and cornered. He had done nothing wrong. Jon had done nothing wrong. Jon had helped him. In the time it took 3 of the prince's own household guard to register what had happened, Jon had made it completely clear to every witness that the prince had needed helping. Cersei arrived the way Cersei arrived at most things, without rushing, because rushing would have announced that something needed managing. She moved through the bystanders and read the room in one breath, her son's face, Jon's hand still technically providing contact on her son's arm, the 2 children behind them with their river sticks. She took all of it in without her expression changing. She found the pretext within the hour. Nymeria had bitten Joffrey before Jon arrived. That part was true. The bruise was real. Cersei used it with the precision of someone who had built cases out of partial truths her entire life. A wolf had attacked a prince. The wolf could not be permitted to live. She had wanted Joffrey to provoke something. The outcome she needed was a Stark animal at fault and a Stark bastard neutralized in some permanent way, and she wasn't getting the second tonight, so she took the first part cleanly. Ned killed Lady in a field behind the camp as the sun went flat against the horizon. Jon heard the wolf's sound first, then the silence after it. The kind of silence that was different from ordinary silence in the specific way all terminal things were different. Not the absence of sound. The end of a particular, irreplaceable thing. His hands had found the pommel of his saddle. He didn't know they'd moved. His jaw was doing something his face hadn't authorized. He made himself breathe the way Sir Roderick had taught him years ago. In the training yard before he was old enough to understand why you'd need it, steady in, controlled out. The kind of breathing you chose rather than the kind that chose you. He didn't look at Ned when his father came back. He wasn't sure he could hold what he'd need to hold if he did. Arya didn't speak for 2 days. Not to Jon, not to Sansa, not to the servants, not to anyone. She sat in the saddle and rode, and kept her eyes on the road, and her mouth shut, and the quality of her silence wasn't grief, exactly, though it was that. It was the silence of a girl who had reached a fundamental and permanent conclusion about what she was dealing with. She had suspected it before. Now she knew. Jon rode beside her. He didn't speak either. There was nothing to say that wouldn't land smaller than the silence, and he knew the silence, and so he stayed in it with her. What came back, in the quiet miles, was Joffrey's face. Not the trapped rage, not the humiliation of the stumble, that was already becoming coin Joffrey would spend later, in ways Jon couldn't fully predict yet. What he kept returning to was the moment before the advance, the complete absence of doubt. The unbroken assumption that what the prince wanted would arrive, because what the prince wanted had always arrived, through status or through force, or through whatever performance of both was required at the time. He had been stopped once on the Trident by a bastard escort who'd helped him up like a drunk at a gate. He would not forget it. Cowards kept excellent records of the moments they couldn't reach their usual tools. Jon filed it the way he filed everything, a fact about a future battlefield. Not the threat the face made, the specific shape of what the face was working around. The lions knew the wolf was watching now. That was the only thing the afternoon had changed. The road south continued. The smell arrived first, before the walls, before the towers of the Red Keep rising above Aegon's high hill to mark the highest defensible point in the Crownlands, before anything he could see. 50,000 people compressed into one place with one river and the sea for drainage. The smell came before the city did, and it was nothing like he'd constructed in his head, because he'd constructed it wrong. He'd built it as a larger Winterfell, stone and cold and familiar in its bones. It was older than that, denser, more human than the North knew how to be. He catalogued the approach the way Ned had taught him to catalog unknown terrain. Exits first, then entry points, then the ratio of walls to gates. The Mud Gate, the Dragon Gate, the Lion Gate. 3 options, 3 choke points, 3 places where a crowd would press hard and guards would spread thin if something happened at once. The Red Keep's towers were the kind of architecture that wanted you to understand something before you got close enough to argue with it. Height mass stone placed by people who controlled the material and intended you to feel that control in your spine when you looked up. The Targaryens had known how to press power into landscape before anything else about them became clear. The small folk lined the streets for the king's return. Jon tracked where the cheering started and where it stopped. It started for Robert. It continued for Robert's horse. It thinned measurably when the Lannister litter came through. Not silence. Silence would have been a different kind of dangerous. Just a reduction in warmth. A temperature the crowd produced without coordinating it. The gap between where the sound rose and where it found reasons to quiet itself was political information nobody had to hand him. He filed it. The throne room was empty on the second afternoon. He'd been sent with a message for the Chamberlain. The Chamberlain wasn't there. The message was minor. What was there, instead, occupying the full length of a hall engineered to make men feel the precise thing kings needed them to feel before they reached the end of it, was the Iron Throne. Jon stood in front of it for 30 seconds. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. The songs built it into something clarified by myth, the swords of 1,000 fallen kings, Balerion's fire fusing defeat into permanence. The songs had admitted that it was ugly, not incidentally ugly, structurally ugly in the way of things built to communicate power rather than beauty, which required the ugliness the way an argument required its sharpest edge. The blades hadn't been smoothed. They protruded from the seat and back at angles that would open an inattentive king. And the histories confirmed several Targaryens had been cut exactly there. Violence made permanent and given a title. The physical proof that sitting above every sword in the realm meant standing on them first. Jon understood it, in the specific way you understood things that had never been explained to you, but that arrived complete when you finally stood in front of them. He didn't sit in it. He didn't touch it. He completed the errand and left. Cersei received Ned's household in formal audience and processed the escort with the quiet attention of someone who had been reading rooms since before she had language for what she was reading. Her gaze found Jon, catalogued his face and his placement, and the exact weight of his status in the party's order, and moved past. The dismissal was deliberate. He was certain of it. She stopped him in a corridor 2 days later. Her voice was warm and constructed with care, pleasantries assembled from the outside in, the way you'd put together a room you intended to use once. He returned monosyllables and no information. She smiled once, the smile of a woman who has tested an edge and confirmed what she expected of it, and continued walking. He watched her until the corridor bent and took her from view. Jaime found him in the practice yard the following morning. Not to fight, to observe, leaning against the far wall with the stance of a man to whom physical competence had long since stopped being interesting enough to perform. Jon kept drilling. When the set was done, Jaime spoke, back foots 2 anchored. A Dornish fighter maps that in 2 exchanges, and you lose your elbow on the 3rd. He came off the wall and demonstrated without explaining, the movement of a man who transmitted information through his body because words were for people who couldn't show you. Jon adjusted, tried it, felt the difference immediately. Jaime nodded once and left the yard without ceremony. Jon stood alone in the morning quiet and tried to identify what had been given. Not generosity. Jaime Lannister didn't carry simple things. It was closer to the reflex of a craftsman watching something done slightly wrong and correcting it before he decided whether he wanted to. He was the one Lannister Jon would not be able to hold in a clean category when the time for categories came. Tyrion found him 3 nights in the small library off the lower corridor. Jon was awake in the unfamiliar heat. The Red Keep breathed differently from Winterfell, stone that held warmth instead of cold, air that didn't sharpen in the chest the same way. He was sitting with a candle and the maps he'd been permitted access to when the sound of uneven footsteps arrived before the door did. They talked for an hour about nothing. Wine, northern customs described briefly, the particular quality of different silences in different kinds of cold. Tyrion did most of the talking, in the manner of a man who had learned that occupation of all available space left no room for the thing he didn't want said. Jon gave him very little to work with. Most men would be more impressed by all this, Tyrion said eventually. The gesture encompassed the Red Keep, the capital, the full machinery of a kingdom performing itself at scale. "I'm not most men," Jon said. Tyrion looked at him, not assessing. The assessment had been completed in the first 10 minutes. This was something else. Closer to the recognition of a man who had spent his life finding other people who existed at the edges of the categories available to them. "No," he said quietly, "I don't think you are." He refilled his cup, changed the subject. Jon returned to the maps. The first morning, Barristan Selmy was at the edge of the practice yard. Jon had been drilling for half an hour before the quality of the observation registered. Not a threat, a presence. He kept his combinations, finished the set. Turned, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was 57 years old and looked a decade younger, in the specific way of men who had never stopped working. His armor was white and immaculate in the gray morning. He was watching Jon with the focused attention of someone trying to place a thing they almost recognized, but couldn't yet confirm. "Your training," Barristan said. "Who taught you?" "Sir Roderick Castle. Winterfell, Northern School." He said it without inflection. "Solid foundation. Your guard runs high, you'll lose your elbow to anyone who fights Dornish style before you see the angle coming." He demonstrated. They drilled briefly, Not a formal session, just exchange. Nothing that couldn't be called a senior knight performing routine courtesy. Barristan said nothing else. He finished, nodded, walked away. Jon stood alone in the yard, cooling down, and identified what had been wrong with it. The old knight hadn't been watching the technique. He'd been watching something beneath the technique, something that needed to move before he could confirm what he was already thinking. He'd watched it move. He'd gone quiet in a way that wasn't the quiet of someone finding nothing. Jon filed it. The back of his neck stayed cold in a way the morning air didn't explain. By the end of the first week, he stood on the upper rampart as the city went dark below him. He ran the inventory the way he'd been running it since the first day, 7 people in the castle reporting to Cersei, 4 unwatched corridors between the 4th and 8th hour. The specific window each morning when Barristan moved through the yard alone. He didn't know what any of it was for. That wasn't the point. You built the map before you needed it. You built it because by the time you needed it, there was no time to build it, and everything you hadn't already learned became the thing that killed you. He would need all of it. He didn't know when. He went inside. Ned gave him the errand in 3 sentences. An armorer in Flea Bottom. Tobho Mott, the best in the city. An apprentice there, big dark-haired, works the forge. He wanted to know if the boy was healthy and settled. He wanted Jon to go in plain clothes, without escort, and come back and tell him. He didn't say why. He said the apprentice's name once, and then looked at the middle distance in the way he looked at things he was filing rather than discussing. Jon didn't ask. He had been in this castle long enough to understand that Ned's silences around certain subjects were the most informative thing about them. He changed his clothes and went. Flea Bottom arrived before he saw it, the same way the city had, smell first. Something older and thicker than the main streets produced, the smell of people without enough water and too little distance between themselves and the thing they'd eaten last week. He'd been in poor settlements before. The villages strung along the King's Road north of the Neck, the outer holdings beyond Winterfell's walls, where families survived on what the winter left them. He'd thought he understood poverty as a scale of the same thing. It wasn't. Flea Bottom was poverty in a different dimension. Not less of what the North had. Absence of the category entirely. He moved through it steadily, not fast. Fast announced either fear or guilt, and he carried neither, but without the hesitation that made crowds read a man as uncertain of his right to be somewhere. He watched the doorways, the narrow alleys between buildings pressed so close together that 2 people couldn't pass without turning sideways. Children who tracked him with the peripheral assessment of someone who had learned that strangers represented a binary, transaction or threat. He gave them nothing to read as the second. He bought nothing. He watched everything. The hammering reached him before the alley opened, a sound with weight in it, not the thin ring of a basic forge, but the deep, metered impact of something being worked properly, someone who knew what the steel needed, and was giving it exactly that, and nothing extra. Jon followed it to the end of a charcoal-smelling lane, and found the smithy. The boy at the forge didn't look up. He was mid-fold on a piece of steel, and people who knew their work didn't stop it for people who walked in. Jon recognized the principle. He waited in the doorway while the hammering continued in its rhythm, the fire throwing orange light across the walls, the heat pressing outward like a physical boundary between inside and outside. When Gendry set down the hammer and looked up, Jon had his first full view. Black hair, blue eyes. The Baratheon build already present in the shoulders and through the chest at 15, not finished yet, still growing into what it would eventually be, but the foundation unmistakable. He was a better physical specimen than Robert Baratheon by a significant margin. And Robert at this point was a man in the late stages of doing something slow and deliberate to himself with food and drink. Gendry had none of that erosion. He had only the structure beneath it, intact. Jon didn't react. "You're Gendry," he said. "Who's asking?" "Nobody," beat. "Someone sent me to find out if you were all right." Gendry's eyes went careful in the specific way of someone who had been waiting their whole life for a particular kind of conversation to begin, and didn't yet know whether this was it. He set the hammer down on the bench with deliberate patience. "Tell them I'm fine. I'll tell them you look like someone who could crack a man's skull with his bare hands," Jon said. which I suspect they already know. Something moved at the edge of Gendry's mouth and didn't become a smile, but came close enough. They talked for an hour. Not quickly. Not the easy talk of people who already trusted each other. The careful exchange of two people taking each other's measure without admitting that was what they were doing. The things said with no particular inflection that were in fact the most specific things available. Gendry knew nothing about his father. A great lord, he'd been told. The apprenticeship at Tobho Mott's had been paid for, and no name had been attached to the payment. And he had been waiting in the educated silence of a boy who understood that knowing the name would change something, and wasn't certain the change would be simple. He was good at his work. He considered this important in the way that people who have built themselves from what they could control, rather than what they were given, considered the thing they'd built important. Jon, who had decided his sword work was the entirety of what was worth knowing about himself, found this completely understandable. What they shared wasn't history. It was the specific condition of having been placed in their circumstances by decisions made about them, and then handed the work of becoming themselves from inside those circumstances. It was not a small thing to share. It made the hour easier than it had any particular right to be. Walking back through Flea Bottom toward the main city, Jon ran the inventory without meaning to, the pattern recognition firing before the conclusion arrived. Gendry, black hair. Blue eyes. The build. He set it against what he'd catalogued in 3 weeks of watching the royal party. Joffrey, golden, green-eyed. Lannister features so complete they read as a portrait rather than an inheritance. Myrcella, the same. Tommen, the same gold and green, the same Lannister template without variation. Robert Baratheon himself, black hair going gray, eyes still blue beneath everything else the years had put there, the frame of a man who had once been something extraordinary, still visible inside what he'd become. Jon didn't know what genetics were. He didn't have the vocabulary of bloodline science, or dominant traits, or the mechanics of inheritance. What he had was the same instrument that told him where a sword was going before it moved, the ability to read the pattern in front of him against the pattern that should be there, and identify the place where they didn't match. Robert's children didn't look like Robert. Robert's bastard, a boy who'd been placed in a flea-bottom smithy without a name on the investment, looked exactly like Robert. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He knew it was the shape of something. He filed it under the same heading as Cersei's dismissal and the specific quality of Ned's silence when he named the errand. The city moved around him. He kept walking. He found Ned late after the evening meal. "The boy is healthy," Jon said. "Settled, good at his work. 16, if anything, he'll be bigger than his master inside a year." He kept his voice level, his face still. "He has black hair, blue eyes." A pause. "He looks like the king." Ned went still in the way of someone who was not surprised. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man who has been carrying something at a particular weight for a long time, and who has just felt that weight shift in the hands of someone else. He looked at Jon with an expression that had no clean name. "Not the children," Jon said. "Not the queens. Gendry looks the way Robert looked 20 years ago. Before..." He stopped. "My lord." The fire in the small brazier moved. Ned didn't. "Say nothing to anyone," Ned said. "Yes, my lord." He went to his room. Lay on the bed in the full dark of a Red Keep night with the city's noise pressing through the stone. The heat that never fully left this place, that the stone stored through the day and released through the dark hours, pressed back against him from the walls. A boy in a smithy with a great lord's money behind his training and no name to explain it. 3 royal children who looked like their mother's family and nothing like their father's. The king himself, with his black hair and blue eyes and his bastards scattered across the realm, every single one of them carrying exactly his colors. The shape of what he'd found was visible now. He didn't have all the lines yet. He had enough to know that the lines existed, and that when he found the rest of them, they would connect into something that wasn't simple. Something was wrong with the throne. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. Something was wrong with the throne. And now he knew part of why. Robert had arranged it drunk. That was the whole of the origin story. A feast 3 nights before the tourney, the king at his most expansive, the wine at its 4th hour, and Ned sitting beside him with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to identify the specific quality of trouble Robert produced when generosity and entertainment arrived in him at the same time. "Let the boy fight," Robert had said. Loudly, the way Robert said most things when the wine was doing its work. These southern lords could use a lesson from the north. He'd grinned at Ned with the grin he'd been deploying since they were boys fostered together under Jon Arryn, the one that said, "Refuse this and tell me why. Go on. I'm listening. Put him in the melee. I want to see what you've been hiding up there in the cold." Ned could not refuse without explaining why he was protecting Jon from visibility. He'd said yes. He always said yes to the things Robert framed that way. Cersei had heard. Cersei always heard. The tourney grounds outside the city gates were the largest gathering Jon had seen in his life, and he processed them as terrain before he processed them as spectacle. The stands were full, hundreds of knights, the entire court arranged in their proper hierarchies of visibility, the small folk packed 3 and 4 deep along the outer fence. The lists for the joust ran north to south along the main ground. The melee bracket was east, a churned field of beaten grass enclosed by rope and post, which was appropriate because there was nothing decorative about a melee. 20 men in the secondary bracket, household guards, junior fighters, a handful of men at arms from various noble retinues who weren't knights but were good enough with a blunted weapon to be worth entering. One of them, Sir Harris, a Lannister household man, had been vocally dismissive of the Northern Wolf all week in front of witnesses, not because he particularly felt it, because he'd been asked to. Jon had catalogued the dismissals without reacting. He understood now what they were for. He was given a blunted sword and a round shield, and a practice helm that sat slightly wrong on his head. No armor beyond a leather jerkin. He looked like exactly what he was, a boy playing in an adult world. The bracket steward who recorded his name wrote it in the smallest letters on the list. Jon tightened the chin strap on the helm and walked onto the field. The melee opened into chaos the way it always did. 20 men with blunted steel and no coordinated objective producing the specific noise of organized violence, attempting to become less organized as fast as possible. Jon moved laterally in the first 10 seconds, away from the heaviest concentration in the center, letting the biggest men find each other first. Basic. The principle wasn't subtle. The men who wanted to be seen fighting gravitated toward the center, where they could be seen. Jon had no interest in being seen. He found his first opponent on the left edge, a guard from some Riverlands holding, decent footwork, telegraphing his overhead by dropping his shoulder half a beat early. Jon read the shoulder, stepped inside. 2 exchanges, and the man's sword hit the grass. He moved on without looking back. In the 3rd exchange of the melee he did the thing Jaime had told him not to do, anchored his back foot deliberately, inviting the read, making himself legible. 2 men adjusted their approach based on it. Then he shifted to the adjustment Barristan had shown him, the weight transfer, the change of angle, and both men found nothing where they expected something. One of them went down from a clean shot to the ribs. The other retreated 2 steps with the expression of someone who had been reading a map and discovered the map was wrong. He fought to finish. He had understood since he was 11 that a fight you won in 30 seconds was better than one you won in 3 minutes, regardless of how either one looked from the stands. He didn't milk the moments. He identified the conclusion of each exchange and drove toward it without hesitation. When 6 men remained, Sir Harris was one of them. The Lannister man was fresh, bigger than Jon, longer reach, trained by people who knew what they were doing even if the purpose tonight was political. He read as someone who had been told this would be straightforward. That confidence showed in his stance before anything else. Jon let him set it. He lost the first exchange deliberately. Not badly, he made it look like Harris was better, which required Harris to be slightly better than his instincts and Jon to manage the specific geometry of controlled retreat. Harris landed a shot to Jon's shoulder that would leave a bruise. Jon gave him the moment. Harris adjusted his next attack based on what he thought he'd confirmed. That was the hypothesis. Now Jon had confirmed it. The second exchange ended without conclusion. The third one didn't. The gap in Harris's guard appeared exactly where Jon's first exchange had created the expectation that it wouldn't, inside the left shoulder on the recovery step. A quarter second after the man's weight committed, Jon was already moving before the gap fully opened. The blunted tip found the junction of neck and shoulder with enough force to register, and Harris's sword dropped, and his knees went briefly soft, and when he straightened his hands were empty. The field was Jon's. The silence came first. One beat of it. Maybe two. The specific silence of a crowd that has just watched something it didn't fully expect and needs a moment to confirm what it saw. Then, the northern bannermen in the stands started it. Stark household men, riders who had spent 6 weeks watching this boy move quietly through the capital and make it look like calm. They started it with the particular conviction of people naming something they'd privately known for a while. Northern Wolf. The small folk picked it up the way they picked up most things at gatherings like this, not because they understood the politics, but because the boy on the field looked like what they wanted to believe existed somewhere. Young, quiet, absolutely certain without performing it. They'd watched him move through their city for weeks. They'd seen him steady a situation at a gate and ride on without breaking stride. They didn't have language for what they were responding to. They had the response. Robert Baratheon, in the King's Stand, was laughing. Genuinely, the great hall laugh that had nothing political in it, the laugh of a man who had wagered against boredom and been paid. He drank and said something to the man beside him and laughed again. He'd arranged this moment half-drunk on a whim and found it completely satisfying in the way that good instincts satisfied you when the outcome arrived. Cersei sat in the royal box without her expression changing. She watched Jon accept the token prize with no ceremony in it, no performance, no extended moment with the crowd. He nodded once at the stands and left the field when it was appropriate to leave. She looked at Joffrey beside her. Her son's face had gone white and then red, and was working back toward white with the specific effort of a boy who had decided that what he was feeling was not allowed to be visible and had found himself incorrect. She placed her hand on his arm. "Be still," she said quietly. Joffrey was still. His hands had made themselves into fists at his sides, the knuckles rigid, and he didn't open them. She felt the tremor in the arm beneath her palm. She looked back at the field, at the bastard from the north cooling down at its edge, watching nothing in particular, not counting anything. She noted it, filed it, moved on. That evening Barristan found him in the yard, incidentally the way the old knight always found him, as if the proximity was administrative rather than chosen. Jon had been cooling down for 10 minutes, and was aware of the approach without looking up. The adjustment in the second exchange, Barristan said. Against the left guard. Where did you learn it? Jon thought about it. Not about the answer, about the reason for the question. I'm not sure I learned it anywhere. I saw the opening. Barristan was quiet. The yard was quiet around them both, the sounds of the tourney's end carrying faintly from outside the walls. What do you know of your mother? Barristan asked. Jon looked at him then. Full eye contact, which was not something he gave without intention. Northwoman, dead, my lord father keeps no portrait. What house? Jon kept his voice level. I don't know. He won't say. Barristan held the look for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then, what family name does the North use for bastards? Snow, Jon said. Yes, Barristan said. Snow. He walked away. He didn't look back. He said nothing more. Jon stood in the empty yard and felt the back of his neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the evening. Snow. He always wondered why that particular word. Cold, clean, covering everything. He went because he couldn't stop hearing it. Not the words themselves, snow, yes, snow, but the specific quality of silence Barristan had left in their wake. The old knight had walked away from a conversation that wasn't finished, and done it without looking back, which meant he'd finished the part he intended to finish, and left the rest for someone else to close. Jon had been turning it over for 3 days, the way you turned a locked door over, not with force, with patience, looking for the place where it opened. The small library was off the lower corridor, past the passage that connected the Tower of the Hand to the servants' quarters. It was not the Grand Maester's collection. That required permission and a sealed request, and a maester standing beside you while you worked. This was the administrative library. Records, correspondence, histories used for daily governance, the working documents of a kingdom managing itself across 17 years of Robert's reign. The maesters used it at all hours. After the 9th hour of night, they didn't. Jon had noted this on his 4th day in the castle. He hadn't had a reason to use it until now. He lit a single candle from the corridor torch and went in. The genealogies were kept in 3 bound volumes along the eastern wall, organized by great house. He found the Starks in the 2nd volume. Most of it was familiar in the way that family history absorbed in childhood was familiar. Names attached to stories, stories attached to places, the whole structure so long established that new information had nowhere obvious to land. He almost missed it. A brief entry, clipped and administrative, among the deaths recorded for 283 Ac, Lady Lyanna Stark, 3rd child of Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell, betrothed to Lord Robert Baratheon of Storm's End. Deceased 283 Ac. Location undisclosed. Dorne. He read it again. Not the North. Not the Riverlands. Not Harrenhal, where the stories always began when they told the story of her. Dorne. He sat with that for a moment. He had been raised on the broad version of this history the way everyone in the North had been raised on it. Rhaegar Targaryen took Lyanna Stark. Robert went to war. Ned brought her home. The story never located her precisely because the story didn't need to. The story needed a girl taken, and a war fought, and a kingdom changed. It didn't need a specific tower in a specific province. But the record needed a province. Records were like that. They were indifferent to the story. He closed the volume carefully and moved to the tournament records. The tourney at Harrenhal was 281 As. 2 years before Lyanna died. He found the record in a slender administrative volume that covered the major tourneys of Aerys's later reign. An unremarkable document, the kind of thing that existed because someone's job required it to exist. The entry for Harrenhal was longer than the others. The tournament had been significant. He read through it until he found what he was looking for. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, winner of the final joust, awarded the crown of winter roses to the Lady Lyanna Stark, sister of Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, naming her Queen of Love and Beauty. This was the story. This was the part everyone knew. He kept reading. The next entry referencing Lyanna was 3 months later. 3 months in which the tournament record noted other events, smaller tourneys, a raven exchange between King's Landing and Storm's End, the routine administrative minutiae of a crown managing itself. 3 months of nothing about Lyanna Stark between Harrenhal and the entry that marked her as missing and Robert's war as begun. 3 months. He set the volume down and sat with what 3 months between those 2 dates meant if you weren't reading the story the way the story wanted to be read. The 3rd document was the one he almost put back. A financial ledger. House disbursements from the royal treasury, 282-283 Ac, the kind of record so genuinely administrative that its survival into the current library was almost accidental. The paper equivalent of something left in a drawer that nobody bothered to clear because nobody cared what was in it. He found it because he was looking for Arthur Dayne. Not deliberately. The name appeared while he was scanning a column, and his eyes stopped on it the way eyes stopped on things that connected to open questions. Disbursement to Sir Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning, for service rendered at Summerhall and engagement at the Tower of Joy, 283 Ac. Arthur Dayne. Rhaegar's Kingsguard. The finest knight of his generation, by every account Jon had ever heard. Dead at the Tower of Joy, killed by Ned Stark and Howland Reed in the last days of the rebellion. The Tower of Joy. In Dorne. Where Lyanna Stark died. Where Ned had gone after the war and come home from with an infant he called his bastard. Jon set the ledger on the table and pressed his hands flat against it and breathed steadily for a moment. He was 14 years old in a library he wasn't supposed to be in a city he'd arrived at 8 weeks ago, looking at 3 documents that weren't individually significant and collectively were something else entirely. He wasn't a maester. He wasn't a spy. He was a bastard from the north who had spent his life being trained to read the shapes that things made when they were arranged in front of him. The shape these made was not finished. He could see that. He was missing too many pieces to name what it was yet. But he could see that a shape existed, and he could feel the specific cold of knowing you've found the beginning of something you can't unfind. His mother had been in Dorne, near a tower where 3 of Rhaegar Targaryen's most loyal Kingsguard had chosen to die rather than leave their post, where Ned Stark had gone after the war and come home from with Jon. He was reaching for the ledger to return it when the footsteps arrived. Petyr Baelish moved through a doorway the way he moved through most things, without announcement, arriving as if his presence had already been agreed upon, and he was simply fulfilling an expectation. He was not surprised to find Jon there. That was the first thing Jon registered. The second was that Littlefinger couldn't see what he'd been reading from this angle. He sat down across from Jon without being invited. He had the ease of a man who had decided long ago that invitations were formalities other people needed. "Late hours for a young lord," Littlefinger said. "Even an unofficial one." "I couldn't sleep," Jon said. He kept his hands still on the table. He kept his voice at the same level it always was. "Neither could I." Littlefinger looked at the shelves with the expression of a man who found libraries decorative rather than useful. "The city talks all night if you know how to listen. These books are part of the city." He paused, the pause of someone who had decided exactly when to say the next thing. "I knew your mother, you know." Jon's hands stayed flat, his face stayed still, his breathing stayed even. "I knew Lyanna Stark," Littlefinger said. "Beautiful woman, fierce, something northern in everything she did, not performed, just present. They say you carry the look of it." He said it warmly. He said it the way you'd say something you'd thought about carefully and decided sounded like a gift. Jon looked at him. Directly. For exactly the time that looking directly communicated what it communicated without excess. Littlefinger's face was warm and entirely constructed. The warmth was placed there in the way you'd place a piece on a board, not felt, positioned. Jon watched it the way he watched a sword hand for the move before the move. "If you ever want to know more about her," Littlefinger said, and his voice stayed warm and built, "I am always available to speak with Lord Eddard's household, for whatever purpose." "Thank you, Lord Baelish," Jon said. He stood. He gathered the documents from the table. He returned each one to precisely where he'd found it, in the order he'd found it, without visible urgency. He left the library. The corridor was dark, and he stood in it for a moment. Littlefinger knew his mother's name. He'd used it deliberately, not as information freely given, as a hook carefully placed, the first inch of something that would require Jon to reach further to understand. The information, if it existed at all, came with a cost not yet stated. That was the structure of it. That was what Littlefinger traded in, information shaped like gifts that turned out to be transactions once you'd already accepted them. He didn't go back to sleep. He went to the training yard and drilled, until the sky went gray, and the city started its morning noise against the walls. He drove the combinations he'd been driving since Winterfell. In the cold and the quiet, and the specific solitude of someone working through something that wouldn't resolve by thinking about it. Tower of Joy. He kept coming back to that name. Robert went hunting on a Tuesday. He came back on a litter 4 days later, with his stomach opened below the ribs, and the particular gray quality to his skin that meant the maester's face when he finished the examination would tell you everything before he spoke. Jon was in the outer yard when the party returned. He saw the litter before he understood what the litter meant, and then he saw the maester's face. And then he understood. The castle changed temperature within the hour. He felt it before he could name it, the specific atmospheric shift of a place where the dominant power structure has just developed a crack that everyone can see, and nobody will yet acknowledge. Guards who had been efficient became watchful. Servants who had been invisible became fast, moving through corridors with the pressed urgency of people who had begun calculating their positions. The Lannister household men, previously present in the way that furniture was present, were suddenly everywhere, in doorways and at corridor junctions, in small groups that were not quite formations but were arranged with purpose. Jon catalogued it all in motion, moving through the Red Keep's passages on his regular route, and the thing he catalogued most carefully was which faces he couldn't find. Ned Steward. 2 of the household guard assigned to the Tower of the Hand. The maester who ordinarily ate in the Great Hall. Something was ending. The shape of what would replace it was already forming. In rooms he hadn't been invited into, while the king bled into his bed above them all. Ned called him to the solar that night. He told him in the direct, economical way he told Jon things that cost him. Robert was dying. The wound was not survivable. A gut wound in a man of Robert's size and condition, in the summer heat, with whatever the boar had carried on its tusk, he had days at most. When Robert died, the throne passed to Joffrey. Jon waited. Joffrey is not Robert's son, Ned said. Not a question. Not a revelation, exactly. Jon had been holding the shape of this answer since the library, since Gendry's face against the royal children's faces, since every piece had accumulated into a structure he couldn't unknow. But hearing it spoken aloud in Ned's voice, in this room, with the weight Ned's voice carried when it said things it had been refusing to say for years, that landed differently from knowing. Gendry, Jon said. Among others. Ned looked at him steadily. Robert's bastards carry his colors. Every one of them. Black hair. Blue eyes. The throne's children carry none of it. Then, the crown belongs to Stannis. Yes, Ned moved to the window. The city below was unaware and loud and entirely itself. I've arranged support with the City Watch. Janos Slynt, the commander. He's been given gold for his loyalty. There is a second installment. He turned back. I need you to deliver it. Go tonight. Confirm the arrangement holds. Jon thought about everything he'd catalogued in 8 weeks. He thought about Slynt's name, which had appeared twice in conversations he hadn't been meant to hear, both times from people who described loyalty as something Slynt performed rather than held. Yes, my lord, he said. He went. The watch barracks were south of the Street of Steel. Janos Slynt received him in a side room off the main floor, private enough for the transaction, public enough that Slynt could claim the meeting was routine if he needed to later. He was a broad man running to soft, with the particular confidence of someone who had reached the ceiling of his own competence and chosen to present the ceiling as a floor. Jon delivered the gold. Stated Ned's terms, the gates held for the Lord Hand if Cersei moved, the watch to stand with the legitimate succession. He stated them cleanly, without elaboration, and watched Slynt receive them. Slynt took the gold. He repeated the terms back with the rehearsed sincerity of a man who had memorized lines for performances he gave regularly. He swore on his honor, which Jon noted was a thing Slynt said rather than a thing he appeared to feel. The tell came when Slynt finished the oath. A glance. Small, less than a second, the eye flick of someone checking an alignment rather than seeking a response. His second in command stood 3 feet to Slynt's right, and the glance went there and came back in the time it took Jon to track it. It was not the look you gave a subordinate confirming an order. It was the look you gave a co-conspirator when the other party in a room had just said the thing you'd both been waiting to hear. Jon thanked Slynt. He left. He stood in the street outside the barracks in the night air and ran the arithmetic without moving. A man confirmed to be reliable checked his accomplice when the reliability was spoken aloud. That was not a behavior pattern that produced reliable men. That was a behavior pattern that produced men performing reliability for a room they planned to leave before the payment cleared. Slynt had taken Ned's gold. Slynt would not deliver. He went back to Ned and said exactly that. Ned looked at him the way Ned looked at things he hadn't fully decided yet. You can't know that from a look. He checked his second when he repeated your terms. Jon kept his voice level, not to confirm the order, the way you check someone when you're performing a false plan in front of the person the false plan is for. He stopped, chose the next part carefully. I've seen you do it, my lord, when you tell the council one thing and mean another. The fire in the brazier moved. Ned was very still. He didn't disagree. He was a man who had given his life to honesty and who had nonetheless learned, in the particular education of a court that ran on layers, that honesty sometimes required a surface. He didn't disagree because he couldn't. The weight he carried, the old weight, the one that had been in his face since Winterfell, settled deeper. Jon watched it happen, watched Ned Stark absorb the possibility that he had been outmaneuvered at the point he'd believed was secured, and that the thing he'd built his plan around was hollow, and that he had not seen it, and that his 14-year-old bastard had. Ned sent the raven to Stannis. Jon didn't ask about the raven's chances. He had been in this city long enough to know that ravens sent in crisis were usually sent too late for the crisis they were sent about. "Stay in the Tower of the Hand," Ned told him. "Whatever happens." "Yes, my lord," Jon said. He followed at a distance. Not close. He wasn't trying to be present. He was trying to see the shape of what was coming before it finished arriving. He took the parallel corridor that ran behind the throne room's eastern wall, the one nobody used after the 8th hour because it connected nothing of importance in the ordinary movement of a day. He moved without a light. He knew this passage now the way he knew the training yard. By feel, by sequence. By the specific sounds each section of stone produced underfoot. He reached the junction that gave him the angle. The throne room's side entrance. The corridor that the small council used. The Lannister gold cloaks were already in position. Not arriving, already there. Already placed, with the particular stillness of men who had been told where to stand and when, and had been standing there long enough that the posture had gone settled. 6 of them at the main entrance. 4 more at the corridor junction to the left. Not the gold cloaks who were loyal to the watch's chain of command. These were the ones whose armor sat slightly differently, whose equipment was slightly better, whose placement made no sense if this was a routine security assignment. Jon pressed into the shadow of the alcove and watched. Ned walked through the throne room entrance with 3 of his household guard. He was moving with the specific purpose of a man who had committed to his course and was executing it. And he didn't look at the gold cloaks because he wasn't expecting them to be a problem. Because Slint had sworn, because the gold had been delivered, because the arrangement had been confirmed. The gold cloaks moved when Ned reached the center of the room. It happened quickly. Not violently. No one drew steel in the throne room. Nobody was stupid enough for that. It happened with the administrative efficiency of something planned. Ned's household guard were separated from him in 3 movements by 6 men who clearly knew the geometry of the maneuver before they performed it. Ned himself was held at the arms by 2 men who knew how to hold a man without giving him anything to push against. He didn't fight it. That was Ned. He would not create violence in a throne room. He would absorb what was happening and look for the legal avenue, and there was no legal avenue, and he knew it and did it anyway. Jon's hands found the wall of the alcove, pressed flat against the stone. He had seen it, and he could not stop it, and he had known, in the part of him that read patterns before they finished arriving, that he would not be able to stop it from this distance. That was not why he'd followed. He'd followed to know, to see the shape completely, to have the full truth of what had just happened rather than a version of it assembled from what he could learn second-hand in a compromised castle. He stepped back from the junction, turned, moved back through the dark passage at the same pace, not running, walking, with his hands steady and his breathing controlled, and his mind already sorting through what he had and what he needed and how much time separated the two. They would come for him next. Not immediately. He was a loose thread, not a priority, and Cersei had other threads to manage first. But soon. An hour, perhaps 3 if she was occupied with the formal mechanisms of what she'd just put in motion. Think, he had to think. He did the inventory in motion. 3 useful relationships in a castle that had just become hostile territory. Gendry, who knew Flea Bottom and owed Jon nothing and would help anyway, that was the reed, and Jon trusted his reeds. The sergeant at the Mudgate who nodded every morning, which was a small thing that was also not small. And Varys, who had never spoken to Jon directly but whose little birds had twice steered Jon away from corridors where men were waiting for someone to walk into them, which was a form of communication that didn't require words. No sword. The knife in his boot. Knowledge of 4 unwatched corridors and the 2 tunnel entrances Arya had shown him in the 3rd week, because Arya mapped every place she inhabited the way other children collected toys, thoroughly, obsessively, with complete seriousness about what the information was for. He found Arya in the passage behind the 2nd-floor gallery. She'd been running. Her face was the controlled fury of someone who had processed what was happening and moved directly to what came next without pausing at the grief of it, which was a thing she and Jon shared so completely they'd never needed to name it. Syrio had held the guards at the door with a wooden practice sword. She didn't say what had happened after she ran. Jon didn't ask. She had Needle. She had the castle's lower passages in her head like a second language. She moved through the dark in front of him with the certainty of someone who had already memorized the route and was simply executing it. "Where are we going?" she said. "Someone first. Then your father." She didn't ask who. She let him down. The room smelled of river water and old stone, and the particular cold of spaces underground that the sun never found. Varys was already there. He looked at Jon the way no one else in the castle looked at Jon, with the complete attention of someone for whom Jon Snow was not a peripheral fact but a central one, and who had been waiting for this specific moment with the patience of a man who had learned to make patience into a tool. "You have your mother's determination," Varys said. Jon went still. "I knew of her. More than most." Varys's voice was the same as it always was, soft, even, stripped of everything that could be read as feeling. "My position required it. She was not what the songs say. The songs needed something simple. She wasn't simple." He didn't explain further. He pulled a folded paper from inside his robe and held it out. Jon took it. A rough map, the passages beneath the Red Keep's eastern quarter, the route to the river gate, notations in a precise hand that indicated the guard positions as of the 9th hour. "Your father is in the black cells," Varys said. "He will remain there as long as he is useful. Cersei wants a public confession. She needs him to stand in front of the court and say the words himself. She won't move him until she has it prepared." He paused. "That is your window. It is not large." Jon looked at the map. "I can't reach the cells from any passage on this." "No," Varys folded his hands. "But you can reach Joffrey." He gave Jon the prince's afternoon route, a private corridor in the Red Keep's northern wing, used during the hour Joffrey spent between his midday meal and his formal appearance in the receiving room. A small escort. The Hound. "You won't get your father out directly," Varys said, "but you might create a condition under which they prefer to let him go." Jon looked at him for a moment. "Why are you helping?" Varys considered the question with the expression of a man deciding how much truth to spend. "Because what happens next matters enormously, and which direction it falls depends significantly on whether you and your father leave this city alive." He paused. "That is a complete answer. It simply isn't the only answer." Jon took the map. He left. He was in the corridor before Joffrey's party entered it. Not hiding, standing in the shadow of an alcove with the stillness of someone who belonged there until the moment he didn't. The Hound came first, 2 steps ahead of Joffrey, scanning the passage with the professional attention of a man who had been guarding bodies long enough to make the assessment automatic. He found Jon immediately. They looked at each other across the corridor. Sandor Clegane was the most dangerous person in this hallway, and both of them understood this without discussion. He was also, Jon had decided in the weeks of observation, the most honest. Not in the way Ned was honest. Ned's honesty was principled, constructed, a thing he'd chosen and defended. Sandor's honesty was the honesty of a man who had watched performance close enough and long enough that he'd lost the ability to find it interesting. He saw through things because pretense had bored him into clarity. "You shouldn't be here," Sandor said. "No." Jon kept his voice level. "But here I am." He spoke past Sandor to Joffrey. "Your Grace, I need a conversation." Joffrey's face did what it did, the complicated arithmetic of a boy whose courage ran in inverse proportion to the capability of his target, working out whether Jon Snow with no drawn weapon in a private corridor represented something he could reach for his usual tools against. It didn't resolve in his favor. Jon watched him find this, and watched what the finding cost him. He wanted to call for guards. The Hound put one hand on his shoulder, not rough, not aggressive. The weight of a hand that said, "Wait." Jon spoke quietly. Factually, the way Ned had taught him to speak when the words themselves needed to carry the weight rather than the tone. "My Lord Father is in your cells. I know what he found about the royal succession. I know what Gendry's face means against your brothers' faces. Cersei knows I know." He paused. "I've already sent ravens north and to Dragonstone. If I disappear in this castle tonight, What those ravens carry becomes evidence in 3 different courts within a fortnight. He let that land. Release my father, your grace. We leave the city. We say nothing. The North puts away its swords. Joffrey stared at him. Jon didn't fill the silence. He stood in it and let Joffrey work through the arithmetic that Jon had already worked through. A bastard who vanished quietly was a rumor. A bastard who'd sent ravens before he vanished was a fact that multiplied with every copy. Sandor was watching Jon with the particular expression he wore when something wasn't performing. Jon met it briefly. The Hound looked away first, which was not a thing Jon had seen him do before. Cersei received the account within the hour. Sandor delivered it without editorializing. The corridor, the boy, the words, in the order they'd occurred. She sat with it in the way she sat with all information she intended to use, without visible reaction, the processing entirely interior. She ran the calculation. A public execution of Eddard Stark produced a martyr. A martyr produced Robb Stark with an army and a cause, instead of Robb Stark with an army and a grievance, and a cause was significantly harder to negotiate with than a grievance. A Stark bastard fleeing the capital with his father was a retreat. Retreats were controllable. Retreats could be shaped into something that looked like mercy if you needed them to, and she might need them to. She sent the word before the afternoon was out. Let the hands escort see Eddard Stark to his sons. Do not follow them past the city gates. Jon moved Ned through the Red Keep's eastern passage 2 hours before dawn. Ned walked with the specific deliberateness of a man managing something internal, not his body, which was intact enough, but the accounting of what had just happened to everything he tried to build. He didn't speak in the passage. Jon didn't ask him to. The Mudgate sergeant was at his post. He saw Jon coming from 40 feet. He didn't say anything. He looked at the 2 figures, looked at the gate, looked back at the city behind him, and made a small adjustment to his position that put him facing outward rather than in. Gendry was at the gate. 2 horses, plainly saddled, tied to the post outside the wall. He was standing beside them with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had decided not to explain how he knew. You need to leave the smithy, Jon said. Tonight, don't go back. I know where to go. Gendry looked at him steadily. Mott's cousin. Kingswood. Jon held the look for a moment. There was something in it that neither of them had language for yet, the specific recognition of 2 people who shared a condition so fundamental that the ordinary vocabulary of friendship didn't quite reach it. He nodded once. Gendry untied the horses and handed over the reins without ceremony. The horses moved. The gate fell behind them. The city compressed into its own noise as the distance opened, the torchlight on the walls going amber and then dim, and then the dark of the road south replacing it. Ned rode beside him in silence for a long time. You should not have stayed, he said finally. You would have done the same, Jon said. Ned was quiet. The horses kept their pace. Yes, he said. I would have. A beat. We need to talk. The city shrank behind them. Jon didn't watch it go. They rode hard for 2 days and didn't talk. There wasn't room for it. The first day was about distance, getting the city behind them fast enough that the decision to let them leave didn't get reconsidered by someone with more nerve than Cersei had credited them. Jon set the pace, read the road ahead, chose the stops. Ned rode and recovered. Not from his body, which had taken handling, but nothing that opened skin or broke bone. From the other thing, the thing with no location. The second day was about the watch. The Gold Cloaks controlled the King's Road's first 20 miles. Jon took them east of it, through the farmland that ran parallel between the road and the river, trading speed for the specific safety of not being where people were told to look. It added hours. It was worth the hours. By the 3rd night they were north of the Trident, and the urgency had changed shape, still present, but no longer the kind that precluded speech. They found a barn off the road, empty except for last season's hay, and the smell of animals not currently occupying it. They watered the horses and Jon set a cold camp. No fire, nothing visible from the road. And they sat in the dark with the Trident's sound carrying faintly through the walls. Ned spoke first. What do you know? Jon told him. He did it in order. The library records, the genealogy with Dorne in it, the tournament record, and the 3 months between Harrenhal and the first missing person reference. The financial ledger with Arthur Dane's name and the Tower of Joy written as fact rather than story. Gendry's face against the royal children's faces. What Barristan asked in the yard. What Varys said in the underground room knew of her, more than most, not what the songs say. He laid it out the way he laid everything out, factually, sequentially, without the editorializing that made information into argument. He had the pieces and he'd found them, and now Ned had to decide what they built. Ned listened without interrupting. In the dark, his face was mostly shadow, but what Jon could see of it wasn't moving toward surprise. It was moving toward something that had no clean name. The loosening of a thing held at maximum tension for a very long time. When Jon finished, he asked his question, "Who was my mother?" The barn was quiet. The horses shifted in their stalls. "We're not there yet," Ned said. Jon kept his voice level. "Then tell me what you can." Ned was quiet for long enough that Jon thought he wouldn't. Then, "She was the bravest person I've ever known." He said it simply, without the weight of performance, just the specific gravity of a true thing. She made a choice that the world told her she wasn't allowed to make. She paid for it. Everything I've done since was to protect what she left behind. Jon sat with that. The barn breathed around them. "She left you a problem," he said. Ned almost smiled. The shadow of it crossed his face and didn't fully arrive. "She left me you." They reached Robb's army in the Riverlands on the 6th day. The northern forces had crossed the neck while Jon was moving through King's Landing's library in the dark. Robb had been moving before Ned's arrest was formally announced, moving on intelligence from ravens sent before everything collapsed, moving on instinct. Moving with the specific velocity of a young man who had spent his life being trained for something and had just been handed it without warning or ceremony. The army that met them on the King's Road was not a grief march. It was organized. It was purposeful. It was doing things that made the southern lords who'd heard the young wolf was coming recalibrate what they'd expected of a boy. Robb came through the camp's edge at a run when the outriders brought word. He reached Ned and grabbed his arm first, wrist to wrist, the warrior's greeting, checking him for damage with the hands before the eyes finished the assessment. Jon watched his brother's face run through relief and fury and relief again in the space of 4 seconds. Then Robb looked at Jon. "You got him out," he said. "Gendry gave us horses," Jon said. Robb looked between them. He decided not to ask about Gendry. Robb's war tent held 4 people that night: Robb, Jon, Ned, and Catelyn. Catelyn had arrived from the Eyrie with Lysa's refusal still fresh. Lysa, who had locked her gates and found reasons not to act that were really reasons not to risk. She looked at Jon when he entered the tent with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 14 years deciding what to do with him and was finding, in this tent, in this context, that her decision required revision. She said nothing. She found her position in the corner and stayed in it. Jon presented what he knew. The same sequence he'd given Ned in the barn, now given to Robb with all the pieces assembled rather than fragmentary, Joffrey's parentage, the genetic evidence across Robert's bastards versus the royal children, the financial record and Arthur Dane, and the Tower of Joy, the full shape of what sat underneath the throne they were riding to contest. He gave it without drama, without the inflection that would make it performance. He gave it as information, because information was what it was. Robb listened the way he listened to everything, with the expression of a young lord who had learned his father's attentiveness and was working to make it his own. Partway through, Jon watched the expression change. Not to shock, to the specific look of someone who has just seen the shape of a thing rearrange itself. He'd been riding south to avenge an injustice. He was now riding south to correct a fraud. Those were the same direction and completely different wars. "The throne belongs to Stannis," Robb said when Jon finished. Then, working through it, "But Stannis has half the lords, and Renly has the other half, and we're between them with no good angle, and—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "We're fighting a lie." "Yes," Jon said. Robb looked at him across the campaign table. At this boy who had spent 2 months in the most dangerous city in the realm, and come out of it carrying more of the truth than men 3 times his age had managed to find. "How did you know where to look?" "Jon, I paid attention." Robb was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face. Not pride, exactly. Something that existed in the same vicinity as pride, but was more specific than that. The look of a brother seeing a brother clearly, possibly for the first time in either direction. He was 17 years old and standing in front of a war he didn't start in a place he didn't expect, and he was growing into it in real time, the way a tree grew, too slow to see, but impossible to stop. Catelyn was still in the corner. She had not spoken since the tent was closed. Jon was aware of her the way he was always aware of her, the careful peripheral attention of someone who had learned early to track the specific weight of her silences. This silence was different from the Winterfell ones. The Winterfell silences had been maintained. Deliberate, the product of a decision she'd made and renewed every day for years. This silence was not maintained. It was suspended. Something in it had come loose and hadn't yet found where to settle. She was looking at him. Not away from him. Not through him. At him, with the expression of a woman who has built a narrative around something for 14 years and has just watched the thing do something the narrative cannot accommodate. He had moved through King's Landing and found the truth of a succession crisis and pulled his father out of a black cell and ridden north with information that was reshaping the entire moral structure of their army's purpose. She didn't speak to him. But she stopped looking away. She held it. She let herself see him. It was more than she had ever given him. For tonight, it was enough. The chanting started at the outer fires. Great Jon Umber's voice, which needed no amplification in any space smaller than a battlefield, said it first. He always said first the things that required a man with no political fear and a body large enough to establish that no argument was available. King in the North. 4 words that the northern lords had been carrying since before they had cause to say them, the old words, the ones that predated the dragons and the Targaryens and the entire southern apparatus of a single crown. The other lords picked them up the way fire picked up dry wood, not simultaneously, but inevitably, one taking it from the next, until the whole camp was the same sound in the same rhythm. Jon heard it from inside the tent. He looked at Robb. Robb's face was doing the thing Ned's face almost never did. It was showing everything at once. The weight of it, the responsibility of it, the specific terror and clarity of a man finding out what he actually was when the performance of what he was supposed to be got stripped away. He was growing into it while Jon watched. Too slow to see, impossible to stop. The way trees grew. 2 wolves. North of the neck. The lions didn't know yet what that meant. The camp had found its night rhythm. Fires burning at the outer ring, guards moving through their rotations, the low sound of an army settled into itself after a long day's march north. Inside it, warmth and noise and the specific density of several thousand people occupying shared purpose. Jon sat outside all of it. He'd found a place at the camp's eastern perimeter where the firelight thinned to almost nothing, and the darkness beyond the torches was the genuine dark of open country, without the city's ambient glow pressing it back. He sat with his knees up and his back against a supply wagon and listened to the camp breathe. He had been doing this for an hour. Not thinking, exactly, letting things settle into their actual weight, rather than the weight urgency assigned them. King's Landing was 10 days behind him, and the city's specific pressure, the constant assessment, the cataloging, the vigilance that had become so automatic he'd stopped noticing it until it eased, had been loosening incrementally since the gates fell away. He wasn't fully loose yet. He wasn't sure what fully loose would feel like. He heard Ned before he saw him. Not the footsteps. Ned moved quietly for a man his size, always had. It was the quality of the approach, the specific rhythm of someone who had been rehearsing something and was arriving at the end of the road where the rehearsal ran out. Ned stopped a few feet away. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood in the way of a man who had been carrying something at maximum weight for a very long time and who had just run out of legitimate reasons to keep carrying it. Then he reached inside his cloak. He held out his hand. Jon didn't move toward it immediately. He looked at what was in Ned's palm first. Small, heavy, a ring, old in the way of things that had outlasted everything around them, the metal worn smooth at the edges from years of contact with skin. A dragon coiled on its face. the detail precise even in the low light. The kind of craftsmanship that had gone into things before the dynasty that commissioned it ended. "She gave it to me to give to you," Ned said. "When you were ready." A pause that had years in it. I've never been sure when that was. Jon took the ring. Cold, heavier than it looked. The dragon's coil pressing into his palm with the specific weight of a house's history compacted into metal. Ned sat down beside him. He didn't make a speech. He told it the way he told everything that cost him, flatly in order, without the inflection that would make it something other than truth. Lyanna Stark had not been taken. She'd gone willingly to Rhaegar Targaryen. Not in ignorance, she'd understood what it would look like, what it would cost, what the world would make of it. She had done it anyway. Ned said she did it because she found in Rhaegar something the arrangement with Robert had never offered her. He said he believed this. He couldn't say it with certainty because the certainty had gone to Dorne with her and hadn't come back. They had married. Secretly, a small sept in Dorne, a septon who'd sworn silence. Two witnesses whose names Ned didn't give because their names didn't matter to the telling. It was legal under the faith. The child she was carrying was not a bastard, had never been a bastard. The Tower of Joy. Rhaegar had left her there when the rebellion turned, left her under the protection of Arthur Dayne and Oswell Went and Gerald Hightower, three of his best, because if you were leaving someone precious somewhere dangerous, you left the best you had. He rode to the Trident to face Robert. He did not come back from the Trident. Lyanna was already dying when Ned arrived. The birth had gone wrong in the way births sometimes went wrong in isolated towers in southern heat, with no proper maester, and no one trained for the specific catastrophe of a labor that turned. She was conscious. She was aware of all of it. She was a Stark, and Starks called things by their names, and she knew she was dying, and she didn't call it anything else. She made Ned swear. "Hold the baby, don't tell Robert." A man who had just won a war on the strength of a woman's honor, or what he believed her honor to be, would see a Targaryen heir as the thing he'd fought to erase. He would be politically correct about this. He would have to be. She knew. She made Ned swear to put the truth in a box and carry the box and never open it where Robert could see. He swore. Her hands were cold by the time he did. He named the baby Jon. He could not name him Aegon, the name Rhaegar had chosen, the name that would have identified him to every maester who knew the Targaryen naming conventions. He gave him the most northern name he could find, stripped of anything that pointed south or across the narrow sea. He carried him home and said what he had to say, and spent 14 years making himself believe it. Jon sat with all of it. He didn't move. Not immediately, not in the first minute, not in the specific way that shock moved people. He received it sitting perfectly still, and the stillness was not shock. It was the feeling of a structure settling into its correct position, the sensation of pieces that had been almost aligned for months finally finding the geometry they'd been approximating. His breathing changed, slowed, deepened, the opposite of the panic he'd felt waking in an unfamiliar room in King's Landing 8 weeks ago. This was the inverse of that, not the world becoming strange, but the world becoming, for the first time, fully legible. His hands. He looked at them around the ring, the same hands he'd drilled with every morning since Winterfell. The same hands he'd pressed flat against a library table in a city that was trying to swallow him. Half Stark, half Valyrian. He had built everything he was on ground that had been described to him incorrectly, and that ground had just shifted beneath him, and he was still standing on it, and it was still ground. The ring was real. That was the point of the ring. Something to hold while the world reorganized. He turned it once in his palm. The dragon caught the distant firelight. He was not Jon Snow. He was Aegon Targaryen. He was Jon Snow. Both of these were true, and neither of them were finished, and he did not know yet what either of them required of him, and the script of his life had just been rewritten at its foundation, and he had no language for what came next, and that was the thing, the specific grief of it, that arrived not as feeling but as the physical fact of his hands going still around a cold ring in the dark. The identity he had built, bastard, nobody, the boy below the salt, was a lie. The life constructed on that identity was built on a lie, which meant who he was, wasn't who he'd thought he was, which meant he didn't know yet who he was. He sat with this for a long time. Then he asked his question. One question. The only question that mattered after all the others. Did she love him? Ned was quiet. The fires in the outer ring moved in a wind that barely reached them. The camp's night sounds continued uninterrupted, indifferent to the specific weight of this particular conversation in this particular dark. She called out his name, Ned said finally. At the end. A pause that had years in it. Not mine. That was the answer. Complete, irreducible, Jon closed his hand around the ring. The chanting reached them from the inner fires first. Great Jon Umber's voice, which needed no amplification, said it before anyone else, because that was what Great Jon did with things he believed. He said them at full volume before the room decided whether they were true, and the room generally decided in his favor simply because the alternative required arguing with a man the size of a barn door. King in the North. The lords picked it up from the inner fires. The soldiers picked it up from the lords. It moved outward through the camp the way all organic things moved, not organized, not orchestrated, just each person taking it from the person beside them, because the words felt like the truest thing available at the moment, and truth spread the way fire spread. Finding everything dry enough to catch, Jon heard it from the perimeter. Robb's name underneath the chant without being in it, every word said for Robb, every word carrying the weight of what a 17-year-old lord was becoming inside that tent right now, in real time, growing into the shape of what the North had always needed, even though nobody had been expecting it to arrive this particular way. He looked at the ring in his palm. He looked at Ned. Ned Stark's face was doing the thing it almost never did, the thing beneath the guilt and the weight and the particular quality of a man who had been carrying a promise for 15 years through everything a life could throw at the carrying of it, the specific release of a man who has finally put something down and can feel his hands again. What do I do? Jon asked. Not with the ring, not with the name, with the whole of what had just been placed in his hands, the identity, the truth, the gap between who he was and who he thought he was, the question of what you built yourself into when the foundation turned out to be different from what you'd been told. Ned looked at him for a moment, the same thing you've always done. Simple, direct, completely Ned. Exactly what needs doing. Jon closed his fingers around the ring. The northern lords chanted. The fires burned at the outer ring. His mother had died saying a dead man's name. His father had died on the trident for something the songs called war, and that turned out to be love, which was not the same thing but which was always, underneath everything, what it actually was. He was not who he'd thought he was. He did not know yet who that made him. He had a ring in his hand, and a camp full of northerners chanting his brother's name, and a father sitting beside him in the dark, who had spent 14 years keeping a promise, and somewhere south of here, a throne sat on swords, and called it authority. And he was 14 years old, and the world was enormous, and he was still in it. He held the ring. The North called its king. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.